In the autumn of 1941, as Operation Barbarossa stretched into its fourth month, the strategic situation on the southern sector of the Eastern Front evolved into a struggle for control of the Black Sea and its critical ports. The city of Sevastopol, located on the Crimean Peninsula, represented one of the most fortified positions in the Soviet Union and the key base of the Black Sea Fleet. Its naval installations at Severnaya Bay, extensive underground bunkers, and interconnected fortifications formed a defensive system built over decades, including after the Crimean War, and modernized in the 1930s. The city's capture would secure Axis control over the Crimean Peninsula, eliminate the Soviet naval threat to Romanian oil fields around Ploiești, and provide a forward base for German and Romanian operations across the Black Sea toward the Caucasus. For Nazi Germany, the capture of Sevastopol was part of Adolf Hitler's broader objective to stabilize the southern front before launching deeper offensives toward the Caucasus oil fields. Army Group South, under General Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt, was tasked with the reduction of the Crimea following the German advance through Ukraine. The operation's execution fell to the 11th Army, commanded by General der Infanterie Erich von Manstein, supported by Romanian forces and the German Luftwaffe. At the outset, the 11th Army fielded approximately 200,000 men, 600 artillery pieces, 200 tanks, and Luftwaffe elements, including around 300 aircraft, though many of these were diverted to other theaters during parts of the campaign. Romanian troops, numbering roughly 60,000, provided critical infantry support, particularly in secondary sectors. On the Soviet side, the defense of Sevastopol was paramount, both militarily and symbolically. The city housed the headquarters of the Black Sea Fleet, commanded by Vice Admiral Filip Oktyabrski, and was garrisoned by elements of the Coastal Army, numbering approximately 106,000 troops by late November 1941. These forces were supported by 600 coastal and field artillery pieces, multiple armored trains, and a small contingent of tanks, primarily T-26 light tanks, totaling fewer than 40 operational vehicles. Naval assets, including cruisers, destroyers, and submarines, enabled the continuous resupply and reinforcement of the garrison, despite Axis attempts to sever sea lanes. Soviet planners viewed Sevastopol not merely as a fortress to be held, but as a bastion from which to project naval and air power into the Black Sea, keeping Axis logistics under threat and tying down German divisions needed elsewhere. Public sentiment and political imperatives in both countries heightened the stakes. In the Soviet Union, propaganda framed Sevastopol as a city fortress that would halt the German advance, echoing the narrative of heroic defense used in other besieged cities like Odessa and later Leningrad. Civilian populations within Sevastopol, numbering over 110,000 before the siege began, were mobilized for fortification construction, with thousands working to expand trench networks, lay minefields, and build anti-tank obstacles. In Germany, state-controlled media emphasized the necessity of neutralizing Sevastopol to secure Axis supply lines in the south, though reports downplayed the difficulty of the task, assuming a quick victory similar to earlier successes in Ukraine. Intelligence estimates shaped initial expectations. German reconnaissance identified Sevastopol's 3 defensive belts, consisting of reinforced bunkers, underground tunnels, heavy artillery batteries such as the 305 mm and 180 mm guns of the Black Sea Fleet, and anti-aircraft positions covering approaches by land and sea. However, the full depth and resilience of these defenses were underestimated by the 11th Army's staff. Conversely, Soviet intelligence anticipated that the 11th Army would attempt to seize Sevastopol before winter, likely expecting a direct assault rather than a prolonged siege. Preparations were made for both scenarios, with reserves held at Novorossiysk and the Caucasus ready to reinforce the garrison by sea. By November 1941, after the Axis captured most of Crimea, apart from Sevastopol and the Kerch Peninsula, the stage was set for the longest and most attritional battle the German 11th Army would fight on the Eastern Front. The siege would stretch over 250 days, from late October 1941 to early July 1942, involving multiple offensive phases, enormous artillery and air bombardments, and combined operations across land, sea, and air. Both sides recognized that the outcome at Sevastopol would not only decide the control of the Crimea, but also shape the balance of naval power in the Black Sea and the security of the southern flank as the war expanded toward the Caucasus. In late October 1941, following the rapid German advance through Ukraine and the capture of most of the Crimean Peninsula, the 11th Army initiated its first operations against Sevastopol. By October 30, Axis forces had taken Simferopol, Yevpatoria, and much of central Crimea, leaving only Sevastopol and the Kerch Peninsula under Soviet control. General Erich von Manstein, commanding approximately 200,000 German and Romanian troops, began consolidating his forces along a line stretching from Bakhchisarai to Balaclava, roughly 15 to 20 kilometers from Sevastopol's outer defenses. The initial objective was to test Soviet positions and secure forward supply bases before launching a full-scale offensive. The Soviet garrison, under Vice Admiral Philipp Oktyabrski and Major General Ivan Petrov of the Coastal Army, had begun reinforcing the city's three main defensive belts. The first line, positioned 15 kilometers from the city center, consisted of trenches, minefields, and fortified outposts designed to slow infantry advances. The second belt, closer to the main harbor, included reinforced concrete bunkers, artillery positions, and anti-tank obstacles. The innermost defenses, around the harbor and key naval facilities, relied on heavy artillery and naval gunfire support, including the use of 305 mm and 180 mm coastal batteries capable of striking targets 20 kilometers inland. By early November, the Soviet garrison numbered roughly 106,000 troops, supported by 600 guns, 34 tanks, and a steady flow of reinforcements and supplies delivered by the Black Sea Fleet. On 1st November, Manstein ordered preliminary attacks to probe Soviet positions, focusing on the northern approaches near Belbek and the southeastern sector near Balaclava. These actions involved elements of the German 72nd Infantry Division and Romanian 4th Mountain Division, supported by field artillery and limited air cover. The engagements revealed the depth of Soviet defenses. Repeated infantry assaults were repelled by coordinated artillery fire and counterattacks, inflicting several hundred casualties on the attackers in the first week. German reconnaissance reported extensive minefields and camouflaged artillery positions, forcing a pause for further preparation. The Luftwaffe, tasked with neutralizing Soviet naval assets and disrupting supply, initiated bombing raids on Sevastopol beginning in early November. Around 200 aircraft, including Ju-88 bombers and Bf-109 fighters, targeted harbor installations, oil depots, and the airfield at Chersonis. Despite these efforts, Soviet naval convoys from Novorossiysk and Poti continued to arrive, delivering an average of 3,000 tons of supplies weekly. The Black Sea Fleet's destroyers and submarines also provided fire support against advancing Axis troops, complicating German efforts to cut off the city entirely. The first significant Axis assault took place on 11 November 1941. Manstein concentrated 3 infantry divisions, supported by 150 artillery pieces and Romanian mountain troops, for a frontal attack on the northern defensive belt near the Belbek River. Over 3 days of combat, the 11th Army advanced only a few kilometers at the cost of more than 2,000 casualties, while Soviet defenders, benefiting from well-prepared positions and accurate artillery, lost approximately 1,500 men but maintained their lines. Bad weather and the onset of winter further hampered operations, forcing Manstein to call off large-scale assaults by mid-November. Throughout the remainder of November and into December, the 11th Army focused on consolidating positions and bringing forward heavy artillery, including 210 mm howitzers and preparations for deploying the 600 mm Karl Jarrett self-propelled mortars. The Soviets, aware of the buildup, accelerated their defensive preparations, with thousands of civilians working alongside military engineers to extend trench networks and fortify key strongpoints. The Black Sea Fleet increased resupply efforts, bringing in an additional 20,000 troops by mid-December, despite Luftwaffe raids. The opening phase of the siege ended with the 11th Army positioned along Sevastopol's outer perimeter, but unable to breach its defenses. The city remained under Soviet control, well supplied by sea and defended by a reinforced garrison. Both sides now prepared for a prolonged and attritional struggle, as Manstein shifted his focus toward assembling the artillery and air power necessary for a decisive assault, while the Soviets prepared for months of bombardment and repeated offensives against their fortifications. By December 1941, the struggle for Sevastopol entered a phase of deliberate planning and logistical buildup, as both sides sought to define their strategic objectives for the months ahead. For the German 11th Army, the primary goal was to capture the city before spring 1942, thereby securing the Crimea, eliminating the Black Sea Fleet's threat to Axis shipping and Romanian oil installations, and freeing divisions for future operations toward the Caucasus. General Erich von Manstein's headquarters devised a plan centered on methodical siege tactics rather than rapid assaults, emphasizing the use of heavy artillery, systematic reduction of fortifications, and the isolation of Sevastopol by land and sea. The operation envisioned concentrated offensives from the north, where the Belbek River sector offered more accessible terrain for artillery deployment, while Romanian forces and secondary German divisions held the southern approaches near Balaclava to pin down Soviet reserves. Logistical preparations dominated the German planning. Sevastopol's fortifications, composed of 3 defensive belts and reinforced with deep bunkers, concrete strongpoints, and naval gun support, could not be overcome by infantry and light artillery alone. The 11th Army staff coordinated the arrival of siege artillery, including 210 mm and 305 mm howitzers, as well as the deployment of specialized weapons such as the 600 mm and Karl Jarrett self-propelled mortars and the 800 mm and Schwerer Gustav railway gun, capable of firing 7-ton shells over 40 kilometers. Ammunition stockpiles were built up along the Bakhchisarai rail line, with over 100,000 tons of shells, fuel, and supplies delivered by late December. The Luftwaffe prepared to commit additional bomber groups, focusing on naval facilities, supply depots, and defensive positions, though their availability fluctuated as other fronts demanded air support. The Soviet command, under Vice Admiral Philipp Oktyabrski and Major General Ivan Petrov, pursued a dual strategy, holding Sevastopol as a fortress while using the Black Sea Fleet to sustain and reinforce the garrison. The defense was bolstered by continuous convoys from Novorossiysk, Poti, and Tuapse, delivering reinforcements, heavy equipment, and supplies despite constant Luftwaffe attacks. Between November 1941 and January 1942, over 30,000 troops, 25 tanks, and thousands of tons of ammunition and food were brought into the city. Soviet naval guns, including 305 mm and 180 mm batteries, provided not only defensive fire but also counter-battery capability, challenging German artillery concentrations. The Soviet High Command, Stavka, viewed Sevastopol as a critical bastion for future counteroffensives in the Crimea, and directed additional air and naval resources to support its defense. Both sides faced miscalculations in their planning. The Germans underestimated the logistical resilience of the Soviet garrison, assuming that Luftwaffe interdiction and Romanian naval patrols would eventually sever the maritime supply lines. Repeated convoy arrivals, often under cover of night or bad weather, negated this assumption, enabling the Soviets to maintain garrison strength at over 110,000 men throughout the winter. Conversely, the Soviets underestimated the scale of the siege artillery being assembled against them. While aware of heavy German guns, few expected the deployment of weapons like the Schwerer Gustav, which could demolish fortifications previously thought impregnable. Propaganda played a central role in shaping morale. German broadcasts depicted Sevastopol as a linchpin whose fall would secure Axis dominance in the south, emphasizing the technological superiority of the heavy artillery and the inevitability of the city's capture. Soviet propaganda, disseminated by radio and print, cast the defenders as a bulwark against fascism, stressing the city's naval heritage and the heroism of both soldiers and civilians. Within Sevastopol, civilian workers, numbering tens of thousands, were integrated into construction battalions, building additional trenches, laying mines, and manning observation posts to augment the overstretched coastal army. By early January 1942, the lines around Sevastopol had stabilized, with the Germans holding positions 10 to 15 kilometers from the city center along most sectors. The 11th Army had amassed over 600 heavy guns, 200 tanks, and several divisions of infantry, including fresh Romanian mountain troops, while Luftwaffe bomber groups began staging for concentrated strikes. The Soviets, with roughly 118,000 troops, 600 guns, and ongoing naval support, strengthened their defenses in anticipation of a major German offensive. Both sides were locked into a campaign that would rely as much on logistics and engineering as on direct combat, setting the stage for the first large-scale assaults of 1942. The first large-scale engagements of the siege began in January 1942, when Manstein ordered a series of coordinated attacks designed to probe and reduce Sevastopol's outer defenses before a decisive offensive. The 11th Army, reinforced with German and Romanian divisions, initiated concentrated assaults on the northern sector near the Belbec River and the eastern approaches toward Mackenzievi Gori. These areas formed critical junctions in the Soviet defensive network, connecting the outer trench lines with the fortified central belt, protecting the city and its naval installations. Manstein concentrated the 72nd and 170th Infantry Divisions, supported by the Romanian 1st Mountain Brigade and heavy artillery, for the initial attacks, while holding the 22nd and 50th Infantry Divisions in reserve for exploitation. On 7th of January, following a 3-hour preparatory bombardment using 210 mm and 305 mm howitzers, German infantry advanced into the outer Soviet trenches near the Belbec Valley. The initial gains were modest, with German troops capturing several forward bunkers and anti-tank positions, but Soviet counterattacks, supported by naval gunfire from the Black Sea Fleet, forced them to halt. The Soviet defenders, primarily elements of the 8th Naval Infantry Brigade and the 388th Rifle Division, utilized camouflaged bunkers, well-sighted machine gun nests, and pre-sighted artillery to repel repeated Axis assaults. Over the course of a week, the 11th Army advanced only 2 to 3 kilometers, suffering approximately 3,000 casualties, while Soviet losses were estimated at around 2,500 men. In the southeastern sector near Balaclava, Romanian mountain troops launched diversionary attacks intended to pin down Soviet reserves. Operating in rugged, hilly terrain, these forces faced entrenched Soviet rifle units and strong points supported by 130 mm coastal guns positioned on nearby heights. The Romanians managed to seize a few outposts, but at a cost of over 1,000 casualties in 10 days, gaining little strategic ground. Despite the limited progress, these actions tied down portions of the Soviet coastal army, preventing them from reinforcing the more critical northern sector. Naval operations played a pivotal role during these first engagements. The Black Sea Fleet continued to sustain the garrison, delivering an additional 10,000 troops and significant quantities of ammunition between 1 and 20 January, despite intensified Luftwaffe efforts to interdict convoys. Soviet destroyers and submarines conducted bombardments of German positions along the coast, targeting artillery emplacements and supply depots. German and Romanian air units responded by launching over 600 sorties during the same period, striking harbor facilities, fuel storage, and shipping lanes, sinking several auxiliary vessels but failing to halt the overall flow of supplies. Civilians within Sevastopol, estimated at 80,000 by January after partial evacuations, experienced the direct impact of the fighting. Many were organized into labor battalions, digging trenches, transporting ammunition, and constructing field fortifications under supervision from the Coastal Army. Civilian casualties rose steadily as artillery bombardments intensified, with Soviet reports noting hundreds killed or wounded during German shelling of outlying districts and industrial areas. Morale among the troops reflected the grinding nature of the combat. German infantry, accustomed to rapid advances in 1941, faced protracted engagements against well-prepared positions, while Romanian troops struggled with difficult terrain and heavy losses. Soviet defenders, though bolstered by ongoing reinforcements, endured near-constant bombardment and shortages of winter equipment. Nonetheless, the cohesion of the garrison held, aided by the steady arrival of supplies and the promise of continued naval support. By the end of January, the first phase of serious combat had yielded minimal territorial shifts. The 11th Army had pushed its lines slightly closer to Sevastopol's central defenses, but had not breached any of the major fortification belts. Both sides absorbed thousands of casualties without decisive gains, and the siege settled into a pattern of attritional fighting, punctuated by artillery duels, airstrikes, and limited offensives. The initial clashes revealed the immense challenge of reducing Sevastopol's defenses and underscored that any eventual breakthrough would require far greater concentration of force and coordination than the January operations had achieved. Through February and March 1942, the siege of Sevastopol escalated into a prolonged phase of bombardment, attritional fighting, and repeated reinforcement, as both sides endured heavy casualties while preparing for larger operations. The 11th Army, now reinforced to a strength of roughly 230,000 men with additional German and Romanian units, committed more than 700 artillery pieces, including 210 mm and 305 mm howitzers, and began positioning the 600 mm Karl Jarret mortars along the northern sector. These weapons, capable of demolishing reinforced bunkers with single hits, were intended to break the static stalemate. The Luftwaffe deployed approximately 250 aircraft to the region, including Ju-87 dive bombers, Ju-88 medium bombers, and Bf-109 fighters, to intensify strikes on Soviet supply convoys, coastal batteries, and defensive positions. Soviet forces inside Sevastopol, numbering around 120,000 troops by March, faced relentless pressure but continued to receive steady reinforcements and supplies by sea. The Black Sea Fleet maintained an average of 3,000 to 4,000 tons of deliveries per week, transporting ammunition, food, and additional units such as the 79th Naval Infantry Brigade and 345th Rifle Division. Naval gunfire, particularly from 305 mm and 180 mm batteries, remained a vital element of the defense, targeting German artillery concentrations and slowing the Axis effort to construct permanent siege positions. Soviet air units, though limited to fewer than 80 operational aircraft in the region, conducted harassment raids against Axis depots and troop assemblies, forcing the 11th Army to divert resources toward air defense. The fighting intensified around the Makenzievy Gori Heights and the Belbek Valley, where German infantry, supported by siege artillery, launched repeated assaults on Soviet trench lines. From mid-February through early March, the 72nd and 132nd Infantry Divisions, backed by Romanian mountain troops, advanced incrementally, capturing several outposts and anti-tank positions. However, every gain was met with counterattacks by Soviet rifle and naval infantry units, often supported by pre-sighted artillery and coordinated fire from coastal batteries. Daily artillery duels saw Soviet guns firing between 2,000 and 3,000 shells, while German batteries answered with upwards of 5,000 rounds, gradually reducing Soviet strongpoints, but at the cost of high ammunition consumption. Casualties mounted steadily on both sides. By late March, the 11th Army reported more than 20,000 casualties since the start of the siege, while Soviet estimates placed their own losses at approximately 18,000, including killed, wounded, and missing. Civilian losses also grew as German shelling of industrial districts and residential areas intensified. Soviet authorities reported at least 1,500 civilian deaths during February and March, as well as widespread destruction of infrastructure. Despite these losses, civilian labor remained crucial to the defense, with tens of thousands continuing to fortify secondary positions, repair damaged bunkers, and maintain communication lines between defensive belts. The weather and terrain compounded the operational challenges. Winter storms in February disrupted Luftwaffe bombing raids and naval convoys alike, while heavy rains in March turned access roads into mud, delaying the transport of heavy guns and ammunition for the Germans. The Karl Gerät mortars, each weighing over 120 tons, required weeks of engineering work to move into firing positions and prepare stable platforms, further slowing the tempo of operations. Supply shortages, particularly of fuel and artillery shells, began to affect both sides, as Axis convoys across the Perekop Isthmus and Soviet supply routes over the Black Sea struggled under adverse conditions and constant attack. Political and command tensions also emerged during this period. Manstein pressed for additional air and artillery support, arguing that Sevastopol could not be taken without full Luftwaffe commitment and the employment of weapons like the Schwerer Gustav railway gun, which was still being positioned for action. Hitler, preoccupied with planning for the 1942 summer offensive toward the Caucasus, reluctantly authorized further reinforcements, but insisted the city be taken quickly to free the 11th Army for future operations. On the Soviet side, Stavka urged the garrison to hold at all costs, with reinforcements prioritized despite concurrent operations on the Kerch Peninsula, where German forces threatened another major offensive. By the end of March 1942, the siege had entered a state of grinding escalation. The 11th Army had tightened its lines and reduced some outlying Soviet positions, but the city's core defenses and its crucial naval lifeline remained intact. Both sides were bleeding resources at a steady rate, and the stage was set for the decisive spring and early summer operations that would determine the fate of Sevastopol. Between April and June 1942, the siege of Sevastopol reached its most intense phase as the 11th Army concentrated its full strength for the decisive assault. Manstein's force, now numbering approximately 240,000 troops, 200 artillery pieces, and about 150 tanks and assault guns, was bolstered by extraordinary siege assets. The 600 mm Karl Gerät mortars had been brought into position, while the 800 mm Schwerer Gustav railway gun was deployed near Bakhchisarai, requiring weeks of construction to lay its special tracks and firing platform. The Luftwaffe, with over 300 aircraft, including Ju-87 Stukas and He-111 bombers, was allocated to the operation, tasked with striking Soviet fortifications, supply lines, and the harbor installations supporting the garrison. The Soviet Coastal Army, under Major General Ivan Petrov, fielded roughly 118,000 men by May, supported by over 600 artillery pieces, 38 tanks, and continuous supply and reinforcement from the Black Sea Fleet. Convoys, escorted by destroyers and submarines, brought in an average of 4,000 tons of supplies weekly, maintaining stockpiles of ammunition and rations despite relentless Luftwaffe bombing raids. The defenders relied heavily on the network of underground bunkers, concrete forts such as Fort Stalin and Fort Maxim Gorky, and the firepower of 305 mm and 180 mm naval guns, which could deliver heavy barrages against advancing Axis troops and artillery emplacements. The German assault, codenamed Sturmfang, Sturgeon Catch, began in earnest on 2 June 1942 with a bombardment unprecedented on the Eastern Front. Over 2,300 guns, including Gustav and Karl Gerät, fired tens of thousands of shells in concentrated barrages against Soviet strongpoints, while the Luftwaffe launched more than 700 sorties on the first day alone. Schwerer Gustav's massive shells, each weighing over 7 tons, targeted key fortifications, including ammunition depots and the coastal batteries of Fort Stalin and Fort Maxim Gorky, successfully destroying several emplacements after repeated hits. Karl Gerät mortars, firing 2.2-ton projectiles, shattered bunkers and trench systems, forcing Soviet troops to withdraw from several outer positions. Infantry assaults followed the preparatory fire, focusing on the northern sector near the Belbek Valley and the central approach toward Makenzievy Gory. The 22nd, 50th, and 170th Infantry Divisions, supported by Romanian mountain units and concentrated armor, advanced behind rolling barrages, capturing several forward Soviet trench lines within the first week. Soviet counterattacks, often spearheaded by naval infantry brigades, inflicted heavy losses but could not prevent the gradual loss of outer defenses. By 10th June, Axis forces had advanced 5 to 8 kilometers in key sectors, though at the cost of over 12,000 casualties, while Soviet losses approached 20,000 due to the overwhelming artillery and air superiority. Civilian suffering escalated sharply during this period. Sevastopol's population, estimated at 80,000, endured continuous bombardment as German artillery and aircraft targeted not only fortifications, but also industrial areas and residential districts. Thousands were mobilized into labor battalions to repair fortifications, transport supplies, and dig new trench lines, often under fire. Soviet authorities reported hundreds of civilian deaths weekly, with many neighborhoods left in ruins by the ongoing shelling and bombing. The intensity of operations strained logistics on both sides. The 11th Army consumed over 30,000 tons of ammunition during the first 2 weeks of June, requiring constant resupply via the Perekop Isthmus and improvised depots. The Luftwaffe faced growing aircraft losses to Soviet anti-aircraft fire and mechanical attrition, reducing operational strength by nearly a third by mid-June. For the Soviets, the main challenge was maintaining their maritime lifeline. Luftwaffe raids sank several supply ships, including the transport Abkhazia and the destroyer Tashkent, suffered severe damage while unloading reinforcements. Despite this, the Black Sea Fleet continued to deliver supplies and evacuate wounded, ensuring the garrison could hold its remaining fortified sectors. By the third week of June, the 11th Army had pushed through most of the outer defensive belts, isolating major forts like Maxim Gorky and reducing Soviet positions to a shrinking enclave around the main harbor and southern districts. Both sides had endured immense losses, and the battle had become a test of endurance and firepower as Manstein prepared for the final assaults to capture Sevastopol before the onset of the Summer Caucasus Campaign. As June 1942 entered its final week, the defenders of Sevastopol, though battered, continued to resist through a combination of entrenched positions, counterattacks, and improvised measures, even as the Axis pressed deeper into the city's final defensive belts. The Soviet Coastal Army, now reduced to around 95,000 combat-effective troops after weeks of losses, relied heavily on strongpoints like Fort Maxim Gorky, Fort Stalin, and the Sapun Ridge defenses. These positions, linked by underground tunnels and supplied through hidden depots, became hubs of resistance, allowing Soviet forces to launch localized counterattacks despite the relentless German artillery and aerial bombardment. Soviet adaptation extended beyond fixed fortifications. Units reorganized into smaller mobile groups, capable of rapid redeployment within the defensive network, utilizing the extensive underground passages to avoid concentrated bombardments. Naval infantry brigades, renowned for their cohesion, conducted night raids on German artillery emplacements, sabotaging guns and supply depots to delay Axis advances. Engineers, often working under fire, built new obstacles, repaired trenches, and set explosive charges along likely German assault routes. Even as heavy casualties mounted, this flexibility allowed the Soviets to prolong the defense and force the 11th Army to expend more time and resources than initially projected. On the German side, Manstein's forces also adjusted their tactics to accelerate the reduction of remaining Soviet positions. The 22nd and 170th Infantry Divisions, supported by assault engineers and flamethrower teams, specialized in clearing bunkers and tunnels, while Panzerjäger units and field howitzers targeted counterattacking Soviet groups before they could regroup. Mobile Kampfgruppen, composed of infantry, assault guns, and engineers, rotated through sectors to maintain constant pressure without exhausting single units. Logistics were tightly controlled, with ammunition and fuel prioritized for siege weapons and infantry support rather than mobile operations, as tanks and armored vehicles played only a limited role in the city's narrow streets and rough terrain. The psychological toll intensified for both sides. German troops, despite superior artillery and air support, faced constant counterattacks and sniper fire, as well as the grueling task of clearing heavily fortified positions in close combat. Romanian units, primarily tasked with holding secondary lines and coastal sectors, suffered high casualties from Soviet raids and bombardments, straining their morale and requiring repeated rotations. Soviet defenders, enduring near-continuous shelling, shortages of medical supplies, and dwindling rations, increasingly relied on the promise of evacuation by sea for the wounded and the belief that holding Sevastopol would buy time for Soviet operations elsewhere in the Crimea and the Caucasus. Resource management became a defining feature of the battle. The 11th Army coordinated its remaining Karl Gerät and Schwerer Gustav ammunition carefully, using each massive round only against the most critical targets, such as Fort Maxim Gorky's armored turrets and key command centers. Luftwaffe sorties, reduced by mechanical attrition and anti-aircraft fire, shifted focus toward interdiction of Soviet supply convoys rather than direct bombing of fortified positions, attempting to sever the defenders' last lifeline. The Soviets, for their part, rationed their remaining artillery shells and naval ammunition, reserving them for counter-battery fire and concentrated barrages during German assaults. Partisan and irregular activity, while limited compared to mainland operations, also contributed to the dynamic of resistance. Small Soviet units infiltrated Axis lines to destroy bridges, disrupt supply depots, and ambush isolated patrols. Though these actions did not significantly alter the broader battle, they forced the Germans to divert manpower to rear-area security, slightly reducing their frontline strength during critical assaults. By 25 June, the Soviet defensive perimeter had contracted to a zone roughly 10 kilometers across, encompassing the city center, key naval facilities, and the Sapun Ridge high ground. Despite dwindling strength and supplies, the defenders maintained organized resistance, inflicting additional casualties on the advancing 11th Army. However, the cumulative effect of weeks of bombardment, attrition, and isolation was becoming evident. The Axis, refining its siege tactics and maintaining pressure, prepared for final coordinated assaults on the remaining strongholds, while the Soviet command began quietly organizing evacuation plans for key personnel and as many wounded as possible, acknowledging that complete relief was unlikely to arrive in time. The final turning point of the siege unfolded between 26 June and 3 July 1942, as the last major Axis offensives broke through Sevastopol's remaining defensive belts and sealed the fate of the Soviet garrison. By this stage, the Coastal Army had been reduced to approximately 80,000 combat-capable troops, with only 400 operational artillery pieces and around 20 serviceable tanks, while ammunition and rations dwindled despite continued efforts by the Black Sea Fleet to resupply the city. Convoys, escorted by destroyers and submarines, still managed to deliver several thousand tons of supplies during the last week of June, but the losses inflicted by the Luftwaffe, including the sinking of multiple transports and damage to escort vessels, made the lifeline increasingly unsustainable. On 26 June, the 11th Army commenced its final coordinated offensive, concentrating the 22nd, 50th, and 170th Infantry Divisions, supported by Romanian mountain troops, assault engineers, and the remaining Karl Jurat mortars. The opening artillery bombardment was one of the most intense of the entire siege. Over 500,000 shells were fired over 3 days, targeting Sapun Ridge, Fort Maxim Gorky, and other strong points anchoring the inner Soviet defenses. Schwerer Gustav, though limited by its slow firing rate, struck several key command and ammunition depots, while Luftwaffe bombers executed more than 1,500 sorties, hitting fortifications, docks, and retreat routes. German infantry assaults advanced behind rolling barrages, using storm groups equipped with flamethrowers, satchel charges, and close support artillery to clear bunkers and tunnel complexes. Fort Maxim Gorky, one of the most heavily fortified positions, was finally neutralized after repeated direct hits from Karl Jurat, and Gustav shells destroyed its armored gun turrets and ventilation systems, forcing surviving crews to abandon the position. By 29 June, German forces captured Sapun Ridge, a commanding height overlooking Sevastopol's southern districts and harbor, effectively splitting the Soviet defense into isolated pockets. The Soviet defenders mounted desperate counterattacks, primarily led by naval infantry brigades and remnants of rifle divisions, but their lack of armor, artillery, and air support limited their effectiveness. The Black Sea Fleet attempted to provide fire support with cruisers and destroyers, bombarding German positions along the coast, but sustained air attacks from the Luftwaffe forced most of the fleet to withdraw after several vessels were damaged or sunk. Soviet air assets, reduced to fewer than 30 operational aircraft, played only a marginal role, conducting harassment raids at night with limited impact. As the city's inner defenses collapsed, Soviet command shifted its focus to evacuation. Between 30 June and 2 July, the Black Sea Fleet conducted emergency operations, evacuating an estimated 25,000 personnel, including wounded soldiers, technical specialists, and command staff, under constant Luftwaffe attack. Many evacuation attempts were disrupted by German air raids, resulting in the loss of several transports and hundreds of casualties. Remaining Soviet troops, cut off from organized retreat, continued to fight in scattered groups within the ruins of the city, with some holding out in underground bunkers and coastal caves even after organized resistance had ended. On 3 July, Manstein declared Sevastopol secured after over 250 days of siege and combat. German and Romanian forces had captured over 90,000 prisoners, including the majority of the remaining coastal army, and seized vast quantities of equipment and supplies. Axis casualties for the final phase of the assault were estimated at 20,000 killed, wounded, and missing, while Soviet losses, including killed, wounded, captured, and evacuated, exceeded $120,000 for the entire siege. The Black Sea Fleet suffered the loss or damage of multiple vessels, reducing its operational capacity for the remainder of 1942. The fall of Sevastopol marked the end of Germany's longest continuous battle on the Eastern Front, freeing the 11th Army for redeployment toward Army Group South and the forthcoming advance into the Caucasus. For the Soviets, the loss deprived them of their principal naval base on the Black Sea and a fortified bastion that had tied down significant Axis forces for nearly 9 months, signaling a major strategic setback despite the defenders' prolonged resistance. With Sevastopol's defenses shattered and organized resistance broken by 3rd July 1942, the aftermath of the siege unfolded in stages marked by surrender, retreat, and the immediate impact on the civilian population and remaining Soviet forces. Of the roughly 118,000 Soviet troops who had defended the city since the beginning of the final German offensive in June, more than 90,000 were captured by the 11th Army, including wounded personnel and rear area staff who had been unable to evacuate. Only around 25,000, primarily command staff, technical specialists, and select units, were evacuated by the Black Sea Fleet during the final days of June and early July. Thousands of isolated Soviet soldiers continued to hide in the city's ruins, underground bunkers, and coastal caves for days after the official end of hostilities, but most were gradually captured by German and Romanian patrols throughout July. The German 11th Army and its Romanian allies, despite achieving their objective, had endured heavy losses that shaped their immediate post-siege posture. Axis forces sustained approximately 35,000 casualties, killed, wounded, and missing over the entire 250-day campaign, with around 20,000 of those losses occurring during the June-July final offensive. The 11th Army's ammunition and fuel expenditures had been massive. Estimates suggest over 2 million artillery shells were fired during the siege, including the ammunition consumed by Schwerer Gustav and Karl Gerett. The logistical strain left Manstein's force in need of resupply and rest before it could be redeployed, delaying the 11th Army's involvement in the Caucasus campaign by several weeks. Civilians bore the brunt of the immediate consequences. Sevastopol's pre-siege population, estimated at over 110,000, had been reduced to fewer than 60,000 by July, with many evacuated earlier by Soviet authorities, others killed during bombardments, and thousands fleeing into the countryside during the final German assaults. Those who remained faced widespread destruction. Entire districts were leveled by artillery and airstrikes, and vital infrastructure, including water systems, power stations, and port facilities, lay in ruins. German occupation authorities quickly began screening the remaining population, arresting individuals suspected of partisan activity or Soviet collaboration, while using surviving civilians as forced labor to clear rubble, repair infrastructure, and support Axis logistical needs. The humanitarian situation deteriorated rapidly. Food shortages became critical as supply networks were disrupted, and medical services, already overwhelmed by months of fighting, were almost non-existent for the remaining civilians. Epidemics, including typhus and dysentery, spread among both the population and prisoners of war, claiming thousands of lives in the months following the city's capture. Soviet POWs faced grim conditions. Many were sent to camps in Crimea and southern Ukraine, where mortality rates were high due to inadequate shelter, food, and medical care. Soviet naval operations in the aftermath focused on evacuating additional personnel and civilians from Crimean ports outside Sevastopol, particularly Novorossiysk, while conducting occasional submarine raids against Axis shipping in the Black Sea. However, the loss of Sevastopol deprived the Soviet Navy of its main base, forcing it to operate from less developed facilities farther east, reducing its ability to disrupt Axis logistics along the Crimean coast. For the Axis, the capture of Sevastopol secured their control of Crimea, eliminated the immediate Soviet naval threat to Romanian oil installations at Ploiești, and freed the 11th Army for redeployment. However, the extensive casualties, ammunition expenditure, and time consumed by the operation meant that Manstein's army could not be committed immediately to Case Blue, the German summer offensive toward the Caucasus and Stalingrad. The delay contributed to later German logistical and operational difficulties, as the Wehrmacht extended its lines deeper into southern Russia. By late July 1942, the city was under full German and Romanian occupation, its strategic role as a Soviet bastion eliminated. The ruins of Sevastopol became both a logistical hub for Axis operations in the Black Sea and a heavily militarized strongpoint intended to secure the Crimea against any Soviet counteroffensive. Yet the devastation left behind, combined with the massive losses suffered by both sides, marked the siege as one of the most costly urban and fortified battles of the entire Eastern Front, with immediate consequences for the local population, the Soviet military presence in the Black Sea, and the Axis strategic timetable. The siege of Sevastopol, lasting from late October 1941 to 3rd July 1942, became a defining episode of the Eastern Front, with long-term consequences for the region, the belligerents, and the broader course of the war. For Nazi Germany and its allies, the capture of the city marked the successful conclusion of their longest continuous battle on the Eastern Front, securing the Crimean Peninsula and eliminating the Soviet Union's primary naval stronghold on the Black Sea. The victory allowed the Axis to consolidate their southern flank, protect Romanian oil fields at Ploiești from naval and air raids, and repurpose Sevastopol's port facilities for their own logistical operations. However, the siege exacted a high cost, more than 35,000 German and Romanian casualties, months of intense resource consumption, and the diversion of specialized siege artillery and air assets that delayed the redeployment of the 11th Army to Army Group South for Case Blue. This delay, though measured in weeks, contributed to stretching the Wehrmacht's timetable as it advanced toward the Caucasus and Stalingrad. For the Soviet Union, the defense of Sevastopol, despite its eventual fall, became emblematic of resistance on the southern front. The garrison of the Coastal Army, supported by the Black Sea Fleet and tens of thousands of civilians, tied down substantial Axis forces for over 8 months, delaying their redeployment and inflicting significant losses. The defense cost the Soviets heavily. Over 120,000 personnel lost, including killed, wounded, captured, or evacuated, as well as severe losses to the Black Sea Fleet, whose ability to contest Axis dominance in the western Black Sea was greatly diminished for the rest of 1942. Yet the prolonged stand slowed the Axis campaign schedule, buying the Soviet High Command critical time to reinforce and prepare defenses in the Caucasus and along the Volga before the summer and autumn battles of 1942. Politically and culturally, the battle became a central narrative for both sides. Nazi propaganda hailed the capture of Sevastopol as proof of German and Romanian resolve and the effectiveness of their military technology, particularly the use of colossal weapons like the Schwerer Gustav and Karl Gerät mortars. Soviet narratives, by contrast, framed the defense as a heroic struggle against overwhelming force, emphasizing the sacrifices of the Coastal Army, naval infantry brigades, and civilian population. Sevastopol was later awarded the title Hero City by the Soviet Union in 1945, cementing its symbolic status despite its capture. The physical and humanitarian toll on Sevastopol and Crimea was lasting. The city's infrastructure, including port facilities, industrial areas, and residential districts, was devastated by sustained bombardment and fighting. Civilian casualties, though difficult to calculate precisely, numbered in the tens of thousands due to shelling, disease, and reprisals during and after the siege. Many surviving civilians were subjected to forced labor under German occupation, tasked with rebuilding the port and clearing wreckage to support Axis military logistics. Agricultural output across Crimea, already disrupted by years of conflict, further declined as the region was reorganized to serve German war needs, leading to widespread shortages and hardship for the local population. Historically, the siege has been analyzed as a case study in the challenges of modern siege warfare. For the Axis, it demonstrated the ability of well-coordinated artillery, engineering, and air power to overcome heavily fortified positions, but also highlighted the immense costs in time and resources required to achieve such victories. For the Soviets, the defense revealed both the strengths and limitations of fortified positions supplied by sea. While the garrison held out for over 8 months, its eventual isolation underscored the vulnerability of static defenses, once maritime and air superiority shifted decisively to the enemy. The lessons of Sevastopol influenced later Soviet planning for urban and fortified defenses at Stalingrad and Leningrad, where logistical resilience and depth of defense were prioritized. In the broader context of the Eastern Front, the siege's outcome marked the end of a phase in which the Axis held the initiative across Ukraine and Crimea. Though the fall of Sevastopol was a tactical and operational victory for Germany, it foreshadowed the overextension and logistical strains that would culminate later in 1942 at Stalingrad. For the Soviets, the battle, while costly, became a source of national pride and a rallying point for propaganda, reinforcing the narrative of eventual resurgence despite severe setbacks. Today, Sevastopol remains a focal point in historical memory, commemorated through monuments, museums, and military studies as one of the most consequential and destructive sieges of the Second World War.